For more than a century, coal was the backbone of industries for the United States and for the rest of the world, and coal mining has always been a dangerous work. But deep in West Virginia, a mine called the Upper Big Branch, owned by Massey Energy, was taking danger to another level. It was predictable that something would go wrong since the mine had a long record of safety violations, racking up more than 1,300 citations in 5 years prior to the accident that killed 29 miners on April 5, 2010. And yet, the mine was never permanently shut down. It kept producing more and more coal because for Massey, paying fines and contesting citations was cheaper than fixing the underlying problems. Massey Energy was one of the biggest coal producers in the United States, and it got that status with a business model that was as aggressive as it was reckless. The company ran dozens of mines across West Virginia and the surrounding region, and was known for a business approach that put production quantity over the basic safeguards that were supposed to protect miners. And if a rule or a regulation slowed the production down, Massey's managers treated it as a problem to be worked around, not followed. In other words, their playbook at the Upper Big Branch mine looked a lot less like an accident-prone operation and a lot more like an organization running a set of deliberate practices to keep coal moving. In October 2005, for instance, Don Blankenship, as the CEO of Massey Energy, told deep mine superintendents to ignore anything that didn't directly run coal, even if that was for the sake of the safety of the workers. If any of you have been asked by your group presidents, your supervisors, engineers, or anyone else to do anything other than run coal, you need to ignore them and run coal. This memo is necessary only because we seem not to understand that coal pays the bills. This kind of attitude also showed up in how their records were kept when investigators found that the mine kept 2 sets of books. A book about internal production and maintenance logs that documented existing hazards inside the mines, and a separate official set of mine examination records that were presented to regulators that often excluded those hazards. The deception was implemented even further into the way the mine ran every day, where guards at the gate would call out over radio what workers called the Mont Coal Channel whenever a federal inspector drove onto the property. This would give the crews inside a few minutes to act, so that when the inspection team reached the mining face, all the readings looked normal, even if they weren't. The mine superintendent Gary May later admitted in court that this was their standard practice. He also described how ventilation doors were opened or closed on command, how monitors were temporarily disconnected, how everything was staged to pass a check that, on paper, was supposed to be unannounced. Once inspectors left, the settings were switched back and the mine went on producing coal under the same dangerous conditions. In 2009 alone, inspectors had written more than 500 citations at Upper Big Branch, many of them for conditions serious enough to shut down production. And the fact that the mine kept running anyway told investigators that these weren't isolated mistakes at all, as they were tolerated and even reinforced by a corporate culture that treated fines as just another operating cost. These deliberate practices of violating safety are what turned a dangerous mine into a fatal one. Because on the afternoon of April 5, 2010, the mine's massive coal-cutting machine, commonly known as the longwall shearer, caused a frictional ignition when its cutting bit hit the surface of hard rock instead of coal. This spark ignited methane gas around it, which naturally trapped within coal seams and released during the mining process. Frictional ignitions like this are a well-known hazard in coal mining. They happen often enough that mines are expected to have controls in place, and by themselves they can be survivable if conditions are properly managed. What turned that small ignition into a disaster was the coal dust acting as fuel throughout the mine, and when combined with methane, it created an atmosphere as volatile as gasoline fumes waiting for a match to explode. To prevent this from happening, coal mines are required to spread pulverized limestone commonly known as rock dust. This rock dust then acts like a fireproof blanket that smothers a spark before it can start a chain reaction. This should be the case when frictional ignitions happen in a properly controlled mine. But at the UBB, long stretches of the mine were coated in fine coal dust while rock dusting was inconsistent at best. So when that spark lit the methane, the fire picked up coal dust, lifting it into the air and turning a small ignition into a propagating explosion. The shearer and other continuous mining machines are supposed to have water sprays and other systems that reduce the creation of fine dust at the mining face. But there was evidence that the shearer's water spray system were not adequately maintained. Multiple spray nozzles were either missing or not functioning, and MSHA later documented that at least 7 sprays on one drum were missing altogether. Mines are also supposed to use strong ventilation to dilute methane and to keep coal dust from building up. But UBB management had a long history of playing games with the ventilation system where airflow was often tampered with to keep methane readings low enough to pass inspections, even if it made conditions more dangerous for the men underground. So when the explosion hit, the system was already fragile and the blast wave further destroyed what ventilation controls were left that normally helped manage airflow. Once those were gone, air currents shifted unpredictably. Instead of containing the fire, the airflow carried burning coal dust and flame deeper into the mine, feeding more ignitions and allowing the explosion to spread even further. The official report from the Mine Safety and Health Administration showed that the flame front traveled through the longwall section and into the tailgate entries, pushing out toward the main mine entries. The force propagated almost 2 miles underground, leaving behind charred stoppings and destroyed conveyor systems. Rescue teams who entered after the blast also found evidence that the explosion had run through multiple sections almost without losing momentum. What the investigations made clear was that the explosion at the UBB was technically expected. Both methane ignition and coal dust propagation are known hazards in coal mining. That's why federal regulations require mines to be kept heavily rock-dusted and properly ventilated, and why the equipment that controls dust is supposed to be functioning at all times. Each one of those systems was compromised at UBB, and because of that, one spark became one of the deadliest mining disasters in recent American history. In fact, investigators even pointed out that the conditions at UBB looked almost identical to earlier mining disasters from the early 20th century, such as the 1907 Monongah mine disaster that killed at least 362 miners, which indicates that nothing about this tragedy was new or unforeseeable. In total, 31 men were on site that day. 29 men were found dead when the mine was cleared and only 2 survived. Rescue crews worked under limits ordinary people don't usually have to imagine. They entered when they could, but rising methane and carbon monoxide readings forced them out repeatedly. The atmosphere underground was very unstable as gases spiked to levels that could knock rescuers unconscious within minutes. Each re-entry was dangerous, but the work continued until every man was accounted for. And once the last body was brought out, the focus shifted from rescue to accountability, from the miners to the people who had put them inside a dangerous mine. Federal agents from the FBI and the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office, ran a multi-year criminal probe that stretched into prosecutions and corporate deals. The government treated this incident as a criminal enterprise investigation, which took a considerable amount of time because there was a massive amount of evidence and the corporate structure was complicated. On the corporate side, the biggest move came in December 2011 when Alpha Natural Resources, which had bought Massey's assets in mid-2011, struck a deal with the Department of Justice to resolve the company's criminal exposure. Alpha agreed to a $209 million package that included restitution payments to families and survivors, fines, a dedicated mine safety fund, and required safety investments. And at the same time, MSHA issued its own package of 369 citations and roughly $10.8 million in civil penalties tied to the investigation and the agency's final report that blamed Massey's policies and culture. And over several years, federal prosecutors won multiple convictions up and down the Massey chain. The mine's security chief, Huey Stover, was convicted of lying to investigators and obstructing the probe, for which he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Gary May, the Upper Big Branch superintendent, pleaded guilty to conspiring to impede the investigation and was sentenced to 21 months in January 2013. David Ugart, a former Massey executive, pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 42 months. And in December 2015, a jury reached a verdict against Massey Energy's former CEO Donald Blankenship. He was found guilty of a misdemeanor conspiracy to willfully violate mine safety standards. In April 2016, he was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison and ordered to pay a $250,000 fine. He was in fact the first CEO of a major American corporation to be imprisoned for safety crimes related to the deaths of his employees. And while he was in jail, he wrote a 67-page manifesto branding himself as a political prisoner. In his own version of events, the government didn't jail him because 29 miners died under his watch, but rather because he was a powerful coal executive who was targeted for being an outspoken conservative who tried to change West Virginia's political direction. This stance contradicted the official investigations, which found the explosion was a direct consequence of Massey's safety failures. Yet in his manifesto, he declared, "I am not only innocent of the claim I conspired to commit willful violations, the government is guilty of conspiring to make up a law in order to imprison an innocent American. I am an American political prisoner." Here's a question honest, fair-minded West Virginians should ask themselves. Would Don Blankenship have received the same justice if he were a Democrat? Would the conservative businessman have been sentenced to a year in federal prison if he were a liberal politician advocating big government, wealth redistribution, globalism, gun control, abortion, same-sex marriage, and all the rest? You can be sure I am fully innocent. In fact, more than 100% innocent. I spent my life improving coal miner safety and exercising my right to free speech. I was not involved in any conspiracy to commit mine safety violations, but I have been involved in trying to bring opportunity to West Virginians. The real conspiracies were the government's cover-up of the UBB truth and my prosecution. These were the core of his manifesto, a complete reversal of blame, casting himself and his company as the true casualties of a political war. Because to Blankenship, the real victims weren't the miners. He and Massey Energy were the ones being persecuted. And I'd like to apologize if I sound biased or something, because for families of the victims, and for many in West Virginia, all these convictions felt deeply inadequate. A disaster that killed 29 men resulted in the industry's most powerful executive spending a single year behind bars? Sure, it was a rare instance of a CEO facing criminal consequences, but it also showed how cheaply workers' lives can be valued when profit is on the line. Maybe that's the bitter truth behind Upper Big Branch, a system that allowed negligence to become routine and thousands of warnings to pile up, only to deliver symbolic justice after disaster struck. And in the end, 29 men and their families had to pay the price. For all the lives that were lost, the least we can do is to remember them with dignity. And may the souls of all the victims rest in peace.